My name is Elsa Mghabghab, and I am Programs Manager at Maxine. Maxine is an advisory firm that improves the ROI of corporate development through effective executive education programs. We work with our partner universities to bring forward world-class content that is relevant to the needs of the Middle East region. Rotman School of Management, as our strategic partner, has joined us today to discuss our upcoming program on leading strategic change in the Middle East. Our promotional webinar today is to educate our network about the program that's happening in September. We will learn more about what to expect, and at the end, we will be sending you an email about it. If you're interested, we can get on an individual call to address your questions and expectations for the program happening in September. If you have questions to the school, today is the right chance to ask them. This is your opportunity for you to talk to the faculty, to Dr. Walid Hijazi with us today, to ask them about this program, what it includes, what is it all about, what is in it for you. We will be spending 60 minutes together with Dr. Walid Hijazi. I'd like to welcome him. Dr. Walid Hijazi from Rotman School of Management will be delivering the course and taking us through the session today. Happy to have you with us, Dr. Walid.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Dr. Walid, thank you. Dr. Walid is Associate Professor of Economic Analysis and Policy and Academic Director at the Rotman School of Management. He has researched, advised, and testified extensively on global competitiveness. He teaches in Rotman's MBA and EMBA programs, and he has also delivered lectures in over 30 countries. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to leave the floor to you and wish you a great session, everyone.
Thank you so much, Elsa, and thank you to Maxine for the opportunity to have this exciting conversation about the region and about how Rotman, in partnership with Maxine, can help deliver executive programs in the region. It's nice to see so many familiar names. I see we have people from across the Middle East. I have some friends on the call from Saudi Arabia. Welcome, Ghazi Zafar. I see you there from Medina. I also see lots of people. Okay. And Mohammed Riyaz, you have your microphone on. Perhaps you could mute. Thank you so much. For those of you that know me, not all of you do, some don't, but I've been traveling to the Middle East for over a decade. As part of the Rotman MBA program, I've taken students to the region extensively, but I've also done consulting for governments and private organizations within the region, focusing on leadership development, change management, government effectiveness, and developing a company's competitive advantage. Now, all of these are absolutely essential in any program in leading strategic change. So that's what I'll talk about now. So the plan for today is I'm just going to go through some slides for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we have a guest, Ilham Al-Bashir, a global thought leader in the development of talent management. I'm going to ask her a few questions because she will also be contributing to the program that we will deliver in partnership with Maxine in September. So more details on that shortly. So I'll just share my slides now, and I'll take you through just some motivation for the study of change within the region. But also, I'm going to end with an in-depth discussion about the program that we are going to deliver. Okay, so every generation thinks that the change that they're experiencing is somehow unique. Oh, there's never been change like this. This is what every generation thinks. But here's a quote that goes back 2,000 years. And 2,000 years, a Greek philosopher wrote the following: the only thing that is constant is change. What this means is that we live in a world where business as usual is change. And those organizations, prior to the pandemic, prior to the shift towards sustainable and clean energy, prior to these big monumental changes, those organizations that will most adept to implement change are the organizations that are the most successful. Okay, so It's been 20 years since John Kotter wrote his seminal article, What Leaders Really Do. And this is so fundamentally important, not just for change, but for organizational health more broadly. You think about what is the role of the leader and the difference between leadership and management. One thing that I want to stress today is that leaders need to think about the vision of the organization, the big picture issues, not the day-to-day issues. Those CEOs or those leaders that are involved in the day-to-day miss the bigger picture of where the organization should be going. There's a very famous quote which says that great leaders don't hoard power, they distribute it. In other words, they hire people around them to implement the visions that they create. So if you look at this quote from Kotter from 20 years ago, from 2001, leaders don't make plans. They don't solve problems. They don't even organize people. What leaders really do is prepare organizations for change and then help them cope as they struggle through it. That is, as they struggle through the change. So mastering the art of change quickly is a critical competitive advantage. Now, I haven't defined what a competitive advantage is, but think of competitive advantages as what does the company or the organization do that allows it to make profit in terms of a private sector or to deliver services to all of its stakeholders that meet some benchmark of excellence. So leaders should always be thinking about opportunities and headwinds facing their organizations, not the day-to-day. This is why, for those of you that receive these feeds from social media, you always say, what are the books that these big thought leaders are reading? So when you think about people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, you think about why Barack Obama, I was just looking at his list this morning. Why do people care about what the books that they're reading? Is because you're thinking about the big trends in the economy, in society, that organizations need to adapt to in order to remain relevant going forward. CEOs and leaders should not be involved in the day-to-day. They should be involved in thinking about the strategic direction of the organization and then enabling the organization to implement the change that's needed to achieve that vision. Now let's think about the Middle Eastern context. Now, I know everybody on this call has seen this slide, okay? But every time I look at it, I think of Toronto. And I think of Toronto in 1990. So I moved to Toronto in the 80s. And if you look at the Toronto in the 80s and you look at the Toronto today, it hasn't changed all that much. It hasn't changed all that much. But if you look at Dubai, nothing's perfect, but what's really happened, you can describe this in one word: wow. It's unbelievable that Dubai went from that in 1990 on the left to that in 2003 to the bottom. Now, I love to show this bottom slide in a room that's dark on a big screen. And what drove this? And if you think about all of the massive investments going on across the region in Riyadh, in Doha, in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, and other centers in the GCC, the question becomes, why did Dubai emerge? And it wasn't an accident. Dubai emerged as this place because of leadership and vision on the part of the ruler of Dubai. And the question becomes, why was Dubai able to implement this vision to transform Dubai from what we see in the top left to what we see on the bottom? And it's the first step in what you need to affect change. And it's a sense of urgency. It's almost impossible, to affect change in the absence of a sense of urgency. And if you look at Dubai and the percent of the economy that was oil-based, in 1971, about 50% of the economy was oil-based. In 2012, it's only 2%. And for those of you that know the structure of the UAE, you know that 80% of the economy is in Abu Dhabi. That's where the majority of all of the oil is. And so Dubai had no choice but to implement this change, to move from a fishing community in the 50s, the development of oil. Then basically once oil ran out in the UAE, they had really no choice. And that's why what you see is Dubai. And as I said, nothing's perfect, but it's pretty remarkable what's happened in Dubai. It's now a highly diversified economy. And the other point I must stress, if you look at surveys of leaders across the world and you ask them, what are the top 10 cities you want to visit? Dubai's in that list. That's pretty remarkable considering what Dubai was in 1990. It's incredible what has happened there. The other thing that's remarkable about Dubai, and I'll expand my discussion shortly, is that despite its leading position in terms of a competitive environment for business, but also for expats to feel comfortable to live in, change hasn't stopped. Change continues to emerge within that emirate and within the UAE more broadly, but within the emirate specifically. And for those of you that understand the culture within the GCC region, and especially with the localization programs, so emiratization within the UAE, there are issues around motivating people to work. And one thing about changing the culture, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid in Dubai understands the importance of human capital. If you ask leaders across the region, what is your most important asset? There's a real debate that emerges. Many people say it's oil or natural resources. Other people say it's oil. There's a real debate as to which of these two it is. It really is people, because as the world shifts towards a more sustainable and green economy, the peak oil, we believe, nothing's for sure, but we're past peak oil. But if you look at here on the left, you look on the left and you see what Sheikh Mohammed did. Sheikh Mohammed went into the ministries, found several directors weren't at their desks, and he fired a dozen of them. And what does that do? That's the important message that needs to be sent to everyone in the UAE, but across the region, that human capital and motivation is incredibly important. Not only does everyone need to work to a given level of excellence, it also impacts motivation of other people in the ecosystem that you work with. So if I'm a leader or a senior manager or a director within an organization, and I'm coming in late every day, what kind of message does that send to my employees? So this is a real challenge. So Sheikh Mohammed sent a very strong message. Okay. Another very important message that Sheikh Mohammed sent is in the last excellence assessment, which is on the right. The excellence assessment, which is basically a program where the UAE at the federal and the emirate level bring 100 people from around the world to assess the level of excellence or maturity within organizations. One of the entities that performed very poorly in the last cycle was the Postal Service in the UAE. So the Postal Service in the UAE performed very poorly. So Sheikh Mohammed sent out a series of tweets to say, this performance is not consistent with the culture of excellence we want within the UAE. So you see the UAE continues to push the envelope on changing the culture to ensure that at every level, they're achieving a set of excellence. But in the middle is incredibly important. And this to me is the most important, because as the region diversifies away from oil towards other industries like tourism, hotels, retail, educational tourism, healthcare tourism, even manufacturing, we see that the importance of human capital is only increasing. And in order to be attractive to human capital globally, it's so very important that expats feel comfortable. And so for those of you that have been following this, the UAE has really changed a lot of the rules to make life within the UAE more comfortable. Of course, this is not without controversy. There are people within the UAE that find it offensive, others do not. Certainly people within Saudi Arabia, where I visit regularly prior to the pandemic, find this offensive. But this is the issue around changes within cultures within the region. Okay, so the UAE is also understanding the importance of business and the idea to attract entrepreneurs from around the world. And leading up to the pandemic, there were all of these requirements across the countries in the GCC that you had to have a local partner. There's many good aspects to that, why that's good, but there's many reasons why that inhibits many companies from locating in the region. So what the UAE has now done is passed a set of laws which allows foreigners to have companies within the UAE without a foreign partner. And this is also proliferating to other jurisdictions within the region, Saudi and Qatar as well, because they need to make the environment, the economies more attractive. What we're seeing, we're in the midst of these massive changes as the region adjusts to the new realities, the shift away from petrochemicals and oil towards renewables and so on. This picture on the right, I took this picture. I wish we were in person. I would ask someone, where was that picture taken? I took that picture in late 2019 before the pandemic in Times Square in New York City. I couldn't believe it. So we have someone on the call from Saudi who I work with regularly. I remember we were in a big discussion with people from the Hajj ministry, the ministry in Saudi Arabia that's in charge of bringing people to the kingdom for the pilgrimage. So as you know, Muslims once in their life have to visit the Mecca and Medina as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. There was a big debate as to whether there should be a Hajj plus. What do I mean by that? When people go to Saudi Arabia for their pilgrimage, should there be a policy to encourage them to do additional tourism beyond just being at the holy mosques in Mecca and Medina? You should see the pushback saying that no tourism, it's haram. When people come for their pilgrimage, the focus should only be on praying and they shouldn't do anything else. But what we now see is that culture is changing. Now what we see is you can now get your visa online. In fact, one of the participants on the call actually went with her family prior to the pandemic, got their visa online, and actually went to Saudi Arabia. They're making it a lot easier for people to visit the kingdom because they understand. Another huge discussion that we've been involved in Saudi Arabia is the role of women. And it's not just women driving, but the whole issue around women in the labor force. And I remember one huge conversation we had, which was around whether or not women should work or not, but whether they should be allowed to work in segregated or non-segregated environments. For those of you that know the kingdom, nothing's perfect, but things have changed dramatically. There are women that are proliferating, working in the labor market in non-segregated environments. Change has come to the region, driven by a sense of urgency, and I'll speak more to that. Look at this slide. This to me is the most important slide, because when you look, I highlight the UAE, but it's there for all of the major economies in the region. And if you look at the red dot here for the UAE, which I have in the red block there, that says that what did the price of oil have to be in order for the government to balance its budget? Okay, in 2014, the price of oil in the UAE had to be about $100. So the oil prices had to be $100 in order for the UAE to balance its budget. Okay, and the numbers are here as well for Saudi Arabia. The oil price there also had to be around $100. You can see it here. Okay, also had to be around $100. But if you look at in 2019, the blue bar, you can see in the UAE, that's gone down dramatically. The price of oil only has to be about $70 or $60 in order to balance the budget. So the question is, why, like what happened? How did that change happen? And the reason is that the governments have been able to communicate to their people to say, we can't afford the subsidies that we were giving to people in the economy as we did in the past. This has now changed. So what we see is that subsidies to citizens within the region have been cut dramatically. And people understand that. My extensive converse, I was in a focus group just last week with a group in the UAE. People understand why that's absolutely necessary. So the question then becomes, how do you address this problem? And I have 3 ways to deal with this. Number 1 is to pray for higher oil prices. Okay, not going to happen. Certainly not over the long term. The second is to cut government spending, which is exactly what happened. And the third is probably the one that I would think is the most relevant. It's really to improve the productivity and efficiency and competitiveness of the local economies, to grow the economies. And in order to grow the economies, the change that we're talking about is absolutely necessary. So McKinsey has this wonderful study that talks about since the beginning of the pandemic, in the first 3 months of the pandemic, there was 5 years of digitization that happened. That's unbelievable. And organizations that were agile, that were able to implement digital solutions, that already had a strong online presence, those are the companies that did really, really well during the pandemic. Okay, those companies that resisted change, that resisted this digital revolution, those are the ones that suffered the most during the pandemic. And, you know, HSBC did a wonderful survey, and they looked at 2,600 companies across the region, but 100 in the UAE, and they really talk about what is the characteristics of the companies that were best placed to manage or navigate the pandemic. And what you see are those companies that were most agile, that were amenable to change, that were able to adjust to this new reality, were the companies that were best able to navigate the changes that were needed in order to remain relevant and profitable during the pandemic. And as we begin to exit the pandemic, you know, it's incredible. I had a conversation yesterday with a group of people from the media here in Canada. And the one thing is, those companies that never looked beyond the pandemic in North America are now finding they have a labor shortage. For those of you that follow this, American Airlines had to cancel 10% of its flight because it let so many of its staff go. Very short term. Now what happens is, you're in a post-pandemic world, and now those organizations that had talent management processes in place to think beyond the pandemic, they're the ones that are best placed post-pandemic to remain competitive. So how do you implement change? So this is super high level. We go into this in much more detail during the program, but there are these 8 steps that Cotter laid out in order to achieve change. Okay, and if you look at them, you know, change, creating a climate for change, engaging and enabling the whole organization, and implementing change and really making it stick. But there are these 8 steps, and Cotter and his colleagues wrote several articles and books. And the one point I want to stress, there's so much to say, but those organizations that skip these steps, they have a feeling of success in achieving change more quickly. But that's one of the reasons why 70% of change fails. That's one of the reasons why 70% of change fail. And the reason is that many of these, okay, so there's a question in the chat. Elsa, can I ask you to step in and tell me the comment?
Yeah. Yes, sure. So we have a comment that says, sorry, but I'm not joining that the break-even point is that high level for Saudi Aramco production. It was back at the previous slide when you were talking about.
I understand. Yeah. Yeah. So, so the thank you for that comment. And you think the break-even is a lot lower? Is that the question?
Turhan? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you allow me, it is around 9.9 for, and it is one of the, you know, lower prices, even if you compare with the products to be sold by Venezuela. This is so many. There are so many researchers pinning that, you know, level of US dollar price per barrel. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. Excellent point. These are the data from the IMF. We can debate whether you think they're higher or lower, but the general point is important. And the general point about the kingdom is that prior to the pandemic in 2019, Saudi Arabia, the government had $500 billion in reserves. That's what they had. And the budget deficit in 2019 was $100 billion. which meant at the current spending and oil prices at the time, Saudi Arabia would run out of reserves within 5 years. Now, the pandemic has messed things up, and once we get post-pandemic, we'll see, but I'm sure things are worse. But what does that say? That tells you that at the current spending is not sustainable given oil prices, and that's why the kingdom has been embracing change more aggressively, because the current structure is not sustainable. That's the fundamental point I want to make. Whether you believe these prices are a bit too high or a bit too low, we can debate that. Okay, so thank you for that. Thank you for that. Great point. Okay, so how to
Dr.
implement?
Walid,
Yep.
yeah,
Go ahead.
Dr. Walid, we still have one comment on this topic, which is from Omar Salim. The cost per production is lower, but the government budget has many other elements which are factored in.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Umar. Umar was my former student, one of the top students to graduate from the program. And I always asked him the most difficult question, so he wants to get even here. But this is a similar point to what I just made. You're absolutely right. There's several ways to achieve a balanced budget. I totally agree. One of the reasons why the UAE and Saudi Arabia are so competitive in the oil industry is that in order to get a barrel of oil out of the ground and into a boat to ship across the ocean, in the region, it's about $10 US. In Canada, it's $50 US, and the oil that comes out of the ground in Canada is very dirty. With fracking in the US, it's $40 to $50. So all of these are factored in when I look at this graph. The fundamental point I want to get across in this graph is the following idea, is that as oil prices continue to diminish, the culture within those societies must change. Governments cannot continue to subsidize the economy the way it has in the past. And any of the comments that are made doesn't change that fundamental point. So I'm going to go on now, but we can ask these questions later. So how do you implement change? And so Cotter talked about the need to go through these many steps of change, and the many organizations try to rush through this change only to find that they fail. So there's a real science associated with affecting change, okay? And when you think about Kurt Lewin's model at a very high level, this is the tough part. You have your organization, and for those of you that know Clayton Christensen's book, Innovator's Dilemma, the most well-run organizations often fail because they resist change, and there's a reason for that, part of our conversation during the course. But you take the organization that you have, or society at a government level, you unfreeze it, you start to implement these changes, right? You implement these changes, and then you have to freeze. How do you affect change at a government level, at a societal level, at a government entity level, or a private sector organization? They each have their challenges, and we're going to go through several examples. So let's think about our program. Let's think about the program that we put together, and we're currently still in the development phase, but learning outcomes, understand changes in the local and global landscape. What are the headwinds and opportunities? It's so very important for leaders to understand where the global economy is going and understand how their organization fits within this changing environmental landscape. To identify change that will maintain organizational effectiveness or a firm's competitive advantage and its profitability. There are so many organizations that became complacent. And when change emerged, they thought as the leading corporation or business in the industry, they only found that to be undermined when new technologies or new players within their ecosystem, within the industry or within the market undermined them. And very often competitors come from a place you may not anticipate. So you really need to identify the change that will allow your organization to remain competitive. Clarify the importance of embracing change and its urgency and the benefits of moving quickly. Okay, this third point is so very important. Understand why 70% of change initiatives fail. If you don't understand why change initiatives fail, how then can you actually implement change effectively? You have to know where the pitfalls are. Recognize, understand how to pursue change successfully and avoid those pitfalls. Don't be that 70% of change initiatives that fail or fail to deliver. And generate knowledge using local developed case studies. As I said in the past, Dubai and Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi and Beirut, and Amman and Kuwait City, they are not all the same, and they're not Toronto, they're not New York, they're not Paris. They have their own cultures that need to be taken into account. So we also have a set of sessions in the program that look at designing for change. So understand organizational innovation processes and critical frameworks and models to design strategic change. For those of you that follow executive education, design thinking is incredibly important. So now, especially as a result of the pandemic and the need for more urgent change, how do you design? How do you design organizations or processes in order to affect change more effectively? So leadership increasingly means being comfortable managing and motivating diverse teams of creative and critical thinkers along with new technologies. Okay, so the program is 5 half days. The first half day, introduction and setting the context, understanding these headwinds at the global, also at the local level. Okay, models of change management. What are those processes, those structures that have been proven to lead to successful outcomes? Then day 3 is application of change within the region. You just don't want to get change management cases of the big global companies in the West. You want to think about important companies and change that's happening within the region. Day 4, designing for change. This is really leading edge business thinking about how to set up structures that are agile and are able to affect change effectively and quickly. And then the final day, working within groups, final presentations to a panel of judges. So the case studies, while the theory and practice of change is well established, cultural context matters extensively. The MENA region and the GCC are not the same as the US or Canada or Europe. So we're creating case studies. And just one quick point to show the differences in culture, just to look at power distance, the extent to which workers or individuals accept differences in power within an organization. It's very, very, so the middle two, the purple and the green, are the Middle East. The blue and the orange are Canada and the United States. Look at power distance. That's such a big difference. Individualism versus collectivism, but also ambiguity avoidance. You think these are so very important that have to be taken into account when you lead people, when you manage people, but especially when you affect change within the organization. So the faculty in the program, that would be myself, Walid, and Professor Angélie Beausoleil, a leading thinker globally when it comes to design thinking and especially designing for change. She's really at the forefront of this new area of applying design thinking in an environment for change. We also have the pleasure of having several guest speakers that will be part of the program. Heba Aboud from E&Y, Aragam El-Bashir, who's with us today, and I'll ask her some questions shortly, who's a global thinker when it comes to talent management. Her research is recognized, and she's a highly sought after expert in helping companies work through talent management. Dr. Mohammed Hamadi, Chief Executive Officer of Amanat Holdings. For those of you that don't know Amanat, you should look at online a real broad portfolio of companies across several industries, from healthcare to education and others. And Suleiman Al-Kataib, who's from Salam International. So these are the 4 speakers that will be part of the program. So with that, so we'll be working on, one last slide, I apologize. The group projects, we've identified several group projects that the faculty will work on with the participants in the program. The participants will be working within groups. And the point is that when you leave the program, you will have a fully developed change management initiative for a company or an organization that you care about, that will help you take that back to your organization and understand how well that company or organization is positioned for change and how to identify the change that is needed, and also the process by which to implement change effectively. Okay, with that, I will stop. Thank you. And I can now maybe open the, so Elsa, should I take some questions or should I just go to Ergam and ask her a few questions?
So I think we can move forward a little bit with Ergam. We can move on with the questions with Ergam, and then in the meantime, we ask our audience to prepare your questions. Feel free to send them on the chat. I will read them, or when the time comes, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So I'm going to leave the floor to you, Dr. Walid.
Thank you so much, Elsa. You're so kind. So Ergam, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Okay, you're on mute.
Hi, so thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for having me here today.
Yeah, so Ergam, you and I go way back and we've had lots of conversations about talent development and the important role of leadership. Perhaps you're well known globally for all of the research that you do when it comes to talent management, leadership development. Perhaps you can tell us some of the highlights of the research that you've conducted within the region. Maybe tell us some differences between talent management or leadership development within the region versus, say, within Europe.
Sure, great question. The first thing that ticked me and came to mind is the context of change. And this is my starting point. So I was privileged in working with UAE top leadership and talent for a long time. My experience working with teams from 40 different nationalities and working on transforming the business, the teams from even industries to a new industry. This massive change in the context of change in the UAE is unprecedented. The second experience that we learned from, and that's what really interests me to do this research, is a phenomena in the UAE where things are different. For example, in UK, US, Canada, you see that the leading companies like Microsoft with innovation, change, product innovation again. But in UAE, you see the government leading the initiative of future innovation. So, and the government innovation is not only in digitalization, innovation and coming up with new sources for people to think about. It's a mindset, but it starts with the government, not with the companies. And I interviewed many leaders, and they were really pressured to keep up with the progress of the initiatives that are launched in UAE in general, not only Dubai. Dubai is a very good front face, but I have the privilege of working with organizations even in the Northern Emirates, where pluralistic organizations are coming up rapidly. So it's across the country, and the structure of the human talent in UAE is interesting. We were 15% nationals, 85 expatriates, but now it's coming up to above 18% nationals to expatriates. However, However, the difference in nationalization and multinational organization is being bridged for a reason. Education, executive education, the access of the UAE human capital and the GCC in general to elite education in the likes of UFT, US, you have more than 33% of the national talent are educated in North America. I did not even start touching on Europe. So this is a bridge between what we used to work with as human resources strategists and what we have. So we need not only the call for cultural change, a call for mindset change, because we have paradigms and perceptions about nationalization or Saudization. I interviewed lately a number of CEOs for a position. 99% are educated in US, UK, Australia. So this bridge is what you do, Dr. Walid. This is the customization of a program to fit a context and the talent in that context. So with executive education and education, I think we need to reassess the human capital in our region and update our knowledge about that fact.
Thank you very much for that. And you know, I love that point that you make. And you just mentioned that that's just from North America, but with many of these people being Western educated and then coming to the UAE or to the GCC more broadly, you know, they really don't understand the cultural context in terms of their training. So this is an important bridge. If I were to ask you, Adham, when you think about the role that you play in helping companies identify top talent, how has the changing environment within the region, the idea that you really need top talent that understands the cultural context, how has that resulted in the kinds of people you're looking for, or the kinds of people that, or the characteristics that organizations are looking for to best fit the positions to move the organization forward?
What an excellent question. Usually we used to assess talent based on two factors: skills, education. Now, when we look at talent, we talk about values, about integration, about culture, about understanding of a context and willingness to adapt. And it's not the talent responsibility to know all of that. You need to upgrade your talent specialists in the organization and put it in a more strategic level. For example, when you're hiring levels for middle or junior, it is not easy, but the alignment of talent versus positions is straightforward. Good education, experience, stimulation, induction, and on-the-job training. But when you're talking about seniors, it takes a bit more. And we have a depth in assessing the compatibility and fitness between seniors and the organization they're in. And the culture has changed already. The organization culture has changed already, is changed maybe with the change of context, and maybe we don't come out and talk about it, but it did change for all the reasons that we say. And when I was talking about Western education, I was not exclusively referring to multinational or expatriates. I'm talking about the national workforce in Saudi, and UAE specifically, that's where I cover. They are they're working also internationally, so they're bringing that with them. So our context has changed. Our approach to talent is more strategic and requires more integration to the new context of the region. We're really advanced, and we have a perception to change. When I work in with international talent, the last one was a 30+ years experience in transforming organizations in Australia, UK, and Singapore. Bring it to our region. There is a little bit of cultural shock at the beginning, but if you take the time and to support the new senior talent by integrating them culturally and give them more than the stereotype 90 days to achieve the target, things will be long term and take a little bit longer than the usual. But as I said, the mindset should be changed to accommodate for the context as well. So the stereotyping programs that you take from US and bring it in here and say, okay, we give the CEO 90 days to show us the ultimate return, it's not gonna work.
Thank you so much for that. So Irham, I have 30 more questions, but I'm going to wait until the program to ask them. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Elsa to ask the audience if they have any questions. But thank you so much for that, Irham. We are so excited to have you in the program, and I have 50 more questions for you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Irham. Thank you, Irham, and thank you, Dr. Walid, as well.